Nolan Beckett could have paid off his entire back rent with the money sitting inside the leather wallet he found lying in the rain, but he did not take a single bill. The next morning he carried it to the Ravenscroft Hotel, where the staff looked at his faded work coat as though he had come to beg for scraps. The billionaire Augustus Ravenscroft only meant to offer a polite word of thanks and move on with his morning. Then his eyes dropped to the receipt, to the steady, careful handwriting that spelled out a single name. The cup in Augustus Ravenscroft's hand slipped from his fingers and shattered against the marble floor. After 20 years of searching, the name Nolan Everett had finally walked through his door. Please tap subscribe to find out why a name written on a lost wallet receipt was enough to make a billionaire risk everything he had built. Rain hammered the windows of Beckett Clock and Repair long after closing time, and Nolan wiped down his workbench with the same slow patience he brought to every broken mechanism that crossed his counter. Earlier that afternoon, a courier had delivered a final notice from Ravenscroft Development, informing him that he could either accept a low-ball offer for the storefront his adoptive father had left him, or face condemnation proceedings tied to the neighborhood's new redevelopment plan. The shop was the only inheritance Harold Beckett had given him, and it was also the only thing standing between his daughter and a life with nowhere steady to land. Nolan had no money for a lawyer, and no time to fight a company that owned half the block already. Harold had built this shop from nothing, spending years teaching Nolan the quiet discipline of taking apart something broken and making it whole again without ever cutting a corner along the way. He used to say that a clock either told the truth or it was worthless, and that a man was much the same. Nolan had buried Harold 3 winters ago, and every ticking face lining these walls still felt like a small piece of the only father he had ever known, watching over him from a life he could barely remember before it. Losing the shop would mean losing the last physical proof that Harold Beckett had ever existed at all, and Nolan wasn't ready to let that happen without a fight, even one he didn't know how to win yet. Walking home past the hotel entrance, he nearly stepped over a wallet lying half-hidden beside a planter, soaked through from the storm. Inside was more cash than Nolan had seen in one place in years, along with a black credit card, an employee badge bearing the name Grant Hollis, an unmarked electronic key card, and an old photograph folded down the middle. For one long breath he thought about what that money could mean: 3 months of rent, maybe 4, enough room to breathe while he figured out his next move. His daughter Maeve found him standing at the kitchen table with the wallet open in front of him and asked what he planned to do with it. Nolan sat down heavily and admitted, more honestly than he meant to, that the money could keep the shop open for months, maybe long enough to find a real solution instead of just delaying the inevitable. He told her the money wasn't theirs to keep, even as some tired, frightened part of him wished the decision were harder than it actually was. She looked up at him with the plain logic only an 11-year-old could deliver, and said that meant they had to return it before whoever lost it got scared. Nolan almost laughed despite everything, struck by how easily his daughter cut through a problem that had kept him staring at the ceiling half the night. He thought of Harold then, of the countless small lessons about honesty delivered over this same kitchen table, and understood that Maeve had simply absorbed what he had once been taught himself. The next morning, Nolan walked into the lobby where Ravenscroft Holdings was hosting its shareholder gathering, and the front desk staff eyed him like a man who had already helped himself to the cash inside. Grant Hollis appeared moments later, snatched the wallet from Nolan's hands, and counted every bill in front of him without so much as a nod of gratitude. Instead of thanking him, Grant asked if he was certain he hadn't kept something for himself first. Nolan asked for a signed receipt confirming the wallet had been returned whole, and Grant reluctantly let him scrawl his name and phone number on a scrap of hotel stationery. From a private alcove across the lobby, Augustus Ravenscroft had watched the entire exchange, and he started to walk past without a word until his gaze caught the name written on that slip of paper. His voice came out rougher than he intended when he finally spoke. "Was Nolan Everett the name given to you at birth?" he asked, and the question landed in the lobby like a dropped stone. Nolan told him plainly that Beckett was his legal name and had been for as long as he could remember, though he admitted his old adoption paperwork once listed him under a different one. Augustus asked to speak with him privately, and Grant immediately objected, certain the stranger was working an angle now that he sensed an opening. Vivienne Ravenscroft arrived in the middle of the exchange and recognized Nolan at once as the shopkeeper who had refused to sell his storefront to her redevelopment team. She assumed he had orchestrated the whole encounter to pressure her grandfather into a better deal, and she said so without softening her tone. Nolan felt his patience thinning, but kept his voice level, insisting he had come only to return what belonged to someone else, and wanted nothing in exchange. Augustus asked Nolan to sit down, but before he could say another word, Alistair Pembroke entered the lobby and cut the conversation short with practiced ease. The moment he heard the name Nolan Everett, something behind Pembroke's composed expression flickered, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. He warned Augustus not to put stock in a common name without verifying a proper background first, his tone dismissive in a way that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Nolan, tired of being treated like a con artist in front of strangers, turned to leave, but Augustus stopped him by asking about a woman named Eleanor Rowe. Something in the old man's voice made Nolan pause, and he found himself thinking of the tarnished pendant he always wore, etched with two initials he had never fully understood. He told Augustus that his father had once explained. The pendant was found with him as a small child at a train station 2 decades earlier, and that its letters, E and R, had never meant anything more to him than a mystery from a past he couldn't remember. Augustus reached into his coat and produced a worn photograph, showing a young man who resembled Julian Ravenscroft, a woman who could only be Eleanor Rowe, and a toddler with features that mirrored Nolan's own more than either of them wanted to admit aloud. Vivian studied the photograph and felt the first crack form in a family history she had never questioned before that moment. Pembroke insisted the photograph proved nothing on its own, his voice sharper now, edged with something closer to warning than skepticism. Augustus ignored him and instructed his legal team to reopen the long-dormant search file for a man named Nolan Everett, a decision that visibly unsettled the room. As Nolan walked out into the rain, Pembroke quietly sent a message to Grant, instructing him to recover the key card from the wallet before Beckett realized what it opened. That evening, back at the shop, Nolan discovered the very key card Grant had been sent to retrieve sitting in the pocket of his own coat, apparently dropped there in the scuffle when Grant had grabbed the wallet from his hands in the lobby. 2 days later, Augustus arrived at Beckett Clock and Repair alone, without an entourage, and stood quietly studying the narrow shop with its rows of ticking faces and a single maritime clock mounted above the register. That clock, he said softly, had once belonged to his younger brother Julian. Nolan explained that his father Harold had purchased it secondhand years earlier, never realizing its history, and Augustus allowed himself a small, sad smile at the coincidence. He began to speak, carefully at first, about a woman named Eleanor who had worked as an archivist for Ravenscroft Maritime and fallen in love with Julian despite the family's fierce disapproval of the match. Their son, he said, had been named Nolan, and Julian had died in the sinking of a research vessel called the Meridian 20 years before. Eleanor left the city almost immediately after the funeral, taking her young son with her, and weeks later her car was recovered beneath a bridge with no trace of either of them inside. Investigators concluded that mother and child had likely died in the crash, though without bodies the case was never formally closed. Before his death, Julian had written a letter asking Augustus to protect Eleanor and their son no matter what it cost him, and that letter had haunted Augustus for 2 decades. He confessed to hiring private investigators, contacting adoption registries, and quietly funding searches through charitable foundations, all without success, because somewhere along the way Nolan's original paperwork had been deliberately altered. Nolan listened without softening, and asked why a family with this much wealth and influence would let a mother and child simply vanish without consequence. Augustus admitted that his own father had once threatened to strip Julian of his inheritance entirely if he married outside the family's approval, and that old cruelty still sat heavy in his chest. Nolan asked, bluntly, whether Augustus was looking for him out of guilt or out of interest in an heir who might strengthen his empire, and Augustus did not have a clean answer ready. Nolan refused an immediate DNA test, telling the old man he wasn't willing to let his entire life get rewritten because a stranger recognized a resemblance in an old photograph. As Augustus left, Grant reappeared at the shop entrance and offered Nolan $100,000 in exchange for the key card and a signed agreement to cut all contact with the Ravenscroft family. Nolan understood immediately that the card was worth more than its plain appearance suggested and turned the offer down flat, prompting Grant to warn him that the redevelopment project could erase his storefront within days if he didn't cooperate. Alone that night, Nolan examined the card under his workbench lamp and noticed a small engraved code on its underside reading Emmer-17. A designation that matched almost exactly the name of the vessel his birth father had died aboard. Nolan traced the code to an old train terminal slated for demolition as part of the very redevelopment plan threatening his own shop, a terminal that decades earlier had used a numbering system for its storage lockers, strikingly similar to the one etched on the card. He arrived there the night before the wrecking crews were scheduled to begin, determined to see what the locker held before it disappeared forever. Unbeknownst to him, Vivian had followed at Augustus's request, tasked quietly with verifying whether Nolan's story held any truth, or was simply an elaborate grab for company assets. Their first exchange in the abandoned terminal was tense, each accusing the other of ulterior motives, until practicality forced them into an uneasy partnership. Deep in a forgotten storage room, they found a bank of sealed lockers, dust thick across every surface, and the electronic card finally opened locker number 17 with a soft mechanical click. Inside was a leather notebook belonging to Eleanor, a partially damaged cassette tape, a duplicate copy of a birth certificate under the name Nolan Everett, a sealed envelope addressed to Augustus, and a small maritime compass that had once belonged to Julian. Nolan lifted each item slowly, as though the dust settling off them might carry away whatever fragile truth they still held, while Vivian stood watch near the doorway, unable to speak for a long moment. The notebook revealed that Eleanor had grown convinced someone inside Ravenscroft Holdings was watching her in the months after Julian's death, and that she no longer believed his death aboard. The Meridian had been an accident at all. Page after page recorded small details that meant nothing on their own, but formed a troubling pattern together. A car that idled too long outside her apartment, a coworker who asked pointed questions about her schedule, mail that arrived already opened. Eleanor had written that she trusted almost no one left inside the company by the end, and that the only name she still believed in completely was Augustus, though even that trust had begun to waver in the final entries. Nolan read those pages twice, feeling something shift in his chest each time he recognized his mother's handwriting growing tighter and more frantic toward the back of the notebook, as though she had been racing against a clock she could feel closing in around her. The cassette tape was damaged but partially playable, and in the surviving fragment, Eleanor's voice explained that she intended to leave her son with someone she trusted completely while she went to retrieve proof of what really happened to Julian. Vivian recognized handwriting on several accompanying documents as belonging to the legal department Pembroke had overseen for decades, a detail that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Nolan noticed that the sealed envelope addressed to Augustus had already been opened once before and was now missing whatever it originally contained, meaning someone had known about this locker long before either of them arrived. Before they could examine anything further, the sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor outside, and Grant appeared early with a demolition crew, far ahead of the scheduled timeline. He announced that the area was unsafe and demanded they hand over everything they had found, but Nolan and Vivian slipped out through an old maintenance corridor as the terminal's backup power began to fail around them. There was no violence in the escape, only the tightening pressure of narrow hallways and flickering emergency lights as the building groaned toward its final hours. Clutching the notebook against her chest, Vivian read one last line Eleanor had written near the final pages, a line that would send them both toward their next destination. "If I do not come back," Eleanor had written, "find Edith Carroway, because she knows who was really responsible for Julian's death." They found Edith Carroway living quietly in an assisted care facility outside the city. A woman well into her 70s whose hands trembled the moment Nolan stepped into the room. She said his resemblance to Julian was almost unbearable to look at directly, and it took her several long minutes before she trusted herself to speak clearly. Julian, she explained, had discovered that certain company vessels were secretly transporting hazardous industrial waste under the disguise of energy equipment shipments, a scheme that could have destroyed the company's reputation and invited criminal charges. Pembroke, then a young legal counsel rising quickly through the ranks, had been tasked with erasing every trace of the operation before it became public. Julian boarded the Meridian to retrieve the original shipping logs himself, determined to expose the truth no matter the personal cost, and the vessel suffered a catastrophic failure not long after leaving port. Edith believed, without a shadow of doubt, that the fuel systems aboard the ship had been deliberately sabotaged rather than accidentally compromised. She remembered the weeks before the sinking clearly, how Julian had grown quieter, more careful about what he said, and to whom, as though he already sensed the walls closing in around him. He had confided in her once, late one evening after everyone else had left the building, that he no longer trusted the people closest to his own family, and that he intended to carry the shipping logs off the vessel himself rather than risk them disappearing through anyone else's hands. Edith had begged him to wait, to bring in outside authorities before boarding a ship he no longer trusted, but Julian believed the evidence would mean nothing without his own testimony standing behind it. She had not spoken to a living soul about any of this in 20 years, terrified that admitting what she knew would place her in the same danger that had swallowed Julian and Eleanor both. Sitting across from Nolan now, seeing Julian's eyes looking back at her from a stranger's face, felt like a debt finally coming due. Eleanor had managed to obtain a duplicate copy of the shipping logs and planned to deliver them directly to Augustus, but someone inside his own office leaked her intentions before she ever got the chance. Fearing for her life and her son's safety, Eleanor was forced to leave Nolan behind at the train terminal in the care of a trusted friend named Harold Beckett, who quietly took the boy out of state and eventually adopted him as his own. Edith admitted she had no idea whether Eleanor survived what came after, only that Augustus himself had once signed an order closing the internal investigation into Julian's death entirely. Nolan felt a surge of anger at the revelation, certain now that Augustus had buried his own brother's murder to protect the empire built on top of it, while Vivian struggled to defend a grandfather she could no longer fully explain. Before leaving, Edith pressed a small mechanical key into Nolan's palm, explaining that it opened a private safe belonging to Julian inside the old Ravenscroft Maritime Headquarters building. As Nolan made his way back toward his shop that evening, he received word that the storefront had been sealed off by inspectors citing sudden structural violations, a transparent pressure tactic timed to coincide with everything he had just learned. Grant, it was becoming clear, intended to use the entire redevelopment project as leverage to force Nolan into surrendering whatever evidence he had gathered. His daughter, Maeve, remained safely with a trusted neighbor throughout these events, kept entirely apart from the growing danger surrounding her father. When Nolan finally reached his apartment above the shuttered shop, he found his mother's pendant missing from the drawer where he always kept it, and a note left in its place warning him to leave Briar Glen if he wanted to keep what remained of his family safe. Nolan confronted Augustus directly at the Ravenscroft estate, slamming a copy of the closed investigation order onto the table between them without a word of preamble. Augustus did not deny his signature, and the confession that followed came slowly, each sentence heavier than the last. 20 years earlier, Pembroke had warned him that a public scandal would cost thousands of employees their jobs, that fabricated evidence could be used to frame Eleanor for stealing confidential documents, and that Nolan himself might become a target for people willing to silence anyone connected to the truth. Augustus admitted he signed the order to buy time, intending to protect Eleanor quietly rather than expose everything at once. But by the time he tried to find her, she and her son had already disappeared without a trace. He called it the single greatest failure of his life, choosing damage control over honesty when it mattered most. Nolan told him plainly that his silence had cost a child his name, his history, and every ordinary comfort of knowing where he came from. He described growing up with questions no one could answer, a pendant with 2 letters he never understood, birthdays spent wondering why he sometimes woke from dreams of a man's voice he couldn't place. He told Augustus that a signature on a piece of paper had erased an entire family before he was old enough to remember losing it, and that no amount of money sitting untouched in a trust account could give those years back to him now. Augustus absorbed each word without flinching, understanding that defending himself further would only insult the years Nolan had spent without answers. He admitted that he had told himself, for a long time, that closing the investigation was a temporary measure, a way to buy safety for Eleanor while he worked quietly behind the scenes to protect her. But temporary measures had a way of hardening into permanent silence when no one forced them back open, and by the time Augustus tried to undo what he had done, there was nothing left to find. Augustus did not ask for forgiveness, understanding on some level that he had no right to it yet, and instead handed Nolan the letter Julian had written before boarding the Meridian for the last time. In it, Julian formally acknowledged Nolan as his son and granted him a portion of founding shares in the company, held in trust until his 30th birthday. Those shares, dormant and largely forgotten for 2 decades, had quietly grown into a stake worth billions, carrying enough voting power to reshape the entire board of directors. Pembroke, Augustus explained, had spent years concealing the identity of that beneficiary, positioning himself to seize control the moment Augustus was no longer able to lead. Augustus revealed that his heart condition had worsened considerably in recent months, a fact he had kept hidden from the board entirely, and that a formal succession vote was scheduled within 3 days. If Nolan's identity wasn't confirmed before that vote, Pembroke stood a real chance of controlling the company by manipulating Vivian into a figurehead role. Vivian, hearing all of this for the first time, felt the sting of realizing she may have been groomed as a pawn rather than trusted as an equal. Nolan still refused to accept any inheritance outright, insisting he needed the truth about Eleanor and Julian settled first, before he would even consider what came next. Days later, the results of a DNA test Augustus had secretly arranged, drawn from a cup Nolan had used during an earlier visit, arrived showing a near-certain match confirming Julian as his father. Nolan, Vivian, and Augustus traveled together to the old Ravenscroft Maritime headquarters, a building Pembroke had already arranged to sell off and demolish within the coming weeks. The key Edith had given Nolan opened a hidden mechanical room tucked behind the archive library, its lock stiff with decades of disuse, until Nolan's steady hands coaxed it open using the same patience he brought to every antique mechanism in his shop. Inside the safe were the original shipping logs, a technical report proving the Meridian had been deliberately sabotaged, an audio recording of Pembroke speaking with an outside contractor, the formal trust documents granting Nolan his shares, and one final letter from Eleanor written years after her disappearance. That letter confirmed what none of them had dared to hope, that Eleanor had survived. She had gone back once to retrieve evidence herself, only to be unlawfully detained and pressured into signing an agreement of permanent silence before she was released. The letter described days spent in a room with no windows, questioned by men who never gave their names, until she finally understood that fighting further would only put her son in the path of people who had already proven what they were capable of. Augustus read the letter twice, his hands trembling in a way that had nothing to do with his failing heart, and for a long moment none of them spoke at all inside that narrow hidden room. Vivian set the audio recording aside carefully, as though it might shatter, suddenly aware of just how much history her own family had buried beneath rude paperwork and closed files. Nolan felt the full weight of the story settle over him at once. No longer a mystery to solve, but a life his mother had actually lived through, alone, for 20 years while he grew up 2 states away without ever knowing her name. He thought of every ordinary morning of his childhood, every school drop-off and quiet dinner at Harold's table, and wondered how many of those same mornings his mother had spent somewhere far away, wondering if he was safe. After her release, Eleanor lived under an assumed identity for years, terrified that surfacing again would put her son directly in danger. She had written to Augustus once, hoping he might protect Nolan without exposing either of them, but that letter had been intercepted before it ever reached him. A final address inside the file pointed toward a small town in Oregon, the last known trace of wherever Eleanor had settled. Nolan absorbed the weight of it quietly, the possibility that his mother had been alive this entire time and had never come looking for him directly. Augustus offered the only explanation he had, that perhaps Eleanor believed her reappearance alone would place Nolan back in danger's path. Vivian, digging further through more recent financial records, discovered ongoing payments from an account linked to Pembroke flowing steadily toward a care facility in Oregon, suggesting Eleanor might still be living there under a different name. Before they could leave the building, Grantse sealed the exits from a control panel and triggered a chemical suppression system meant to flood the archive room and destroy whatever remained inside. Nolan worked quickly, salvaging the most critical documents inside old waterproof cases stored along one wall, refusing to let 2 decades of hidden truth wash away in front of him. In the chaos of their escape, Augustus suffered a mild cardiac episode, and despite everything still unresolved between them, Nolan refused to leave him behind, half carrying the older man through the flooding corridor to safety. Water rose steadily around their ankles as alarms blared through the corridor, and Nolan half-dragged Augustus toward the emergency stairwell, while Vivian cleared a path ahead of them through the dark. For a few frantic minutes, none of them spoke. Every ounce of attention narrowed down to the next step, the next breath, the next locked door that had to be forced open before the water climbed any higher. Grant's attempt at sabotage was caught entirely on Vivian's security footage, evidence that would prove impossible for him to explain away later. As paramedics worked to stabilize him, Augustus gripped Nolan's hand and told him, in a voice barely above a whisper, that his mother had never truly abandoned him. She had simply been waiting, he said, for someone to finally prove that this family and this place had become safe enough to return to. With Augustus hospitalized, Pembroke wasted no time calling an emergency board session, declaring the founder unfit to continue leading the company and pushing hard for Vivienne's appointment as interim chair. Behind closed doors, he pressured her to approve the sale of the company's maritime division to an investment fund quietly tied to his own interests. Nolan walked into that boardroom still wearing his weathered work coat, a plain contrast against the tailored suits filling every seat around the polished table. Several board members openly laughed at the sight of a clock repairman stepping into a meeting worth billions of dollars, unaware of the shares he now carried. Pembroke accused him outright of fabricating a bloodline to seize company assets, and Grant testified that Nolan had stolen the key card from the wallet and used it to extort the company. Nolan calmly recounted the entire sequence of events, from finding the wallet in the rain to returning it fully intact without asking for a single dollar in return, his voice steady even as several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He described Maeve's simple words at the kitchen table that night, that they had to give the money back before whoever lost it got scared, and something about a child's plain honesty landed harder in that room than any legal argument could have. A few of the older board members, people who had known Julian personally decades earlier, exchanged glances that suggested old memories stirring loose after years of silence. Vivienne played the hotel's own security footage for the room, proving beyond doubt that Grant's accusations were fabricated from beginning to end. Pembroke tried once more to steer the room, arguing that even an honest man could be manipulated into serving someone else's agenda without realizing it, but his voice had already lost the certainty it carried at the start of the meeting. Grant sat rigid near the back of the room, his composure fraying as the evidence piled higher against the story he had been asked to tell. An independent attorney then presented the DNA results, the original birth certificate, the trust documents, and formal confirmation of Nolan's ownership stake, laying each piece methodically on the table for the entire board to see. Nolan's holdings, once fully verified, amounted to 17% of the company's voting shares, more than enough to outweigh anything Pembroke controlled on his own. Pembroke, refusing to yield, insisted the documentation concerning Julian was manufactured, prompting Nolan to play the recovered audio recording aloud for the room. The recording captured Pembroke's own voice from 20 years earlier, giving explicit instructions to interfere with the vessel's fuel systems before its final voyage. He attempted to leave the room the moment the recording ended, only to find federal investigators already waiting outside the doors. Grant, sensing the walls closing in around him, turned on Pembroke almost immediately, offering testimony against him in hopes of softening his own legal exposure. Vivienne faced an impossible choice in that moment, weighing the company's carefully guarded reputation against the full disclosure of decades of buried wrongdoing. She chose to stand beside Nolan, casting her vote to launch an independent investigation and block Pembroke's proposed sale entirely. The board, shaken and scrambling for stability, offered Nolan the chairman's seat outright, an offer that stunned the entire room when he turned it down without hesitation. Several members pressed him further, arguing that a company this size needed someone with his bloodline steering it through the scandal now unfolding in the press. But Nolan shook his head and reminded them that he had spent his whole life fixing small, honest things, not running empires. He told them plainly that he hadn't come to take Augustus's chair, but to use the power he'd just been handed to finally find the woman who had been missing for 20 years. The room fell quiet at that, the kind of quiet that settles over people forced to reckon with how small their concerns about quarterly earnings suddenly seemed. Vivienne watched him gather the documents off the table, unreadable expressions crossing the faces of board members who had laughed at his work coat only an hour earlier and thought that perhaps this was exactly the kind of leadership the company had been missing for longer than anyone realized. Nolan and Vivian traveled together to a quiet care facility in Oregon, where they found Eleanor living under the name Elaine Porter, worn down by years spent hiding from a threat that had never fully released its grip on her. The pendant Grant had once stolen and later been forced to return sat in Nolan's coat pocket, and the moment Eleanor saw it, recognition broke across her face all at once. Their reunion carried none of the easy warmth of a storybook ending, and Nolan's first question came out sharper than he intended, asking why she had never come back for him. Eleanor admitted there had been countless moments over the years when she nearly reached out, only to receive a photograph of Nolan through unknown channels each time, a quiet reminder that someone was still watching him closely. Living as though she were dead, she explained, had felt like the only way to guarantee her son's safety from people capable of anything. Nolan couldn't offer forgiveness in that moment, not fully, though something in him understood that his mother had also been a victim of the same machinery that had stolen his childhood identity. He asked her what she remembered about the day at the train station, and Eleanor's voice cracked as she described kneeling down to fasten the pendant around his small neck, telling him it would keep a piece of her close even when she couldn't be. She said she had rehearsed 1,000 different versions of coming back for him over the years, only to lose her nerve each time she thought of the photographs that kept arriving as quiet warnings. Eleanor asked if Harold had been kind to him, if he had laughed easily, if he had known how loved he was even without her there to say it herself. Nolan told her about the workbench, about learning to fix things with his hands, about a childhood that had been simple and steady even without the truth sitting underneath it. Something in Eleanor's shoulders loosened slightly at that, as though 20 years of guilt had finally found one small place to rest. Eleanor spoke warmly of Harold Beckett, describing him as Julian's closest friend, a man who had not only taken Nolan in but had deliberately raised him to value honesty above nearly everything else, exactly as Julian himself always had. Nolan realized then that returning the wallet in the rain had never been a random act of decency, but the direct result of values Harold had spent a lifetime instilling in him. Those same values, quietly passed down through an ordinary shopkeeper, were what had eventually led him back to the family he never knew he had lost. Eleanor agreed to return to Briar Glen and testify to everything she knew, making clear she wanted no part of the company's wealth for herself. All she wanted, she said, was for Julian's name to finally be spoken with the honesty it had always deserved. Nolan handed her the small maritime compass recovered from the locker, and Eleanor smiled faintly at the sight of it, remembering how its needle used to stick from time to time. Julian always said that even when it got stuck, she told him, it never once forgot which way was north. Before they left Oregon, Eleanor revealed one more piece of the past neither of them had known, that Julian had quietly established a private fund years ago meant to support families harmed by the company's illegal shipping operations. Augustus, once released from the hospital, stood before the board and the press and offered a public apology to Nolan, to Eleanor, to the families of workers who had suffered under the company's buried misconduct, and to every employee who had once been pressured into silence. Julian's name was formally restored throughout the company's official history, corrected after 2 decades of quiet erasure. Pembroke, along with several associates who had helped him for years, faced prosecution for fraud, obstruction, and deliberate sabotage that had cost a man his life. Grant cooperated fully with investigators in exchange for leniency, but lost his position and any standing he once held within the company entirely. Nolan never became the kind of billionaire who wore his fortune loudly. Instead, he used his newly confirmed voting power to cancel the aggressive redevelopment plans that had once threatened to erase his own neighborhood, establish a compensation fund drawn from assets Julian had left behind, and convert the old commercial block into a community trust designed to protect small shopkeepers like the one he had always been. He kept the clock shop exactly as it was, choosing a seat as an independent board member rather than taking on daily control of the company his father had built. Vivian remained chief executive, now operating under a far more transparent structure that neither she nor Augustus could have imagined only weeks earlier. The relationship between Nolan and Augustus did not mend overnight, and neither man rushed to use the words used that usually come with family. Instead, they built something slower, filled with small conversations, rather than grand declarations. A fragile trust rebuilt one visit at a time. Augustus began stopping by the shop on quiet afternoons, never announcing himself in advance, content to sit on the old stool near the window and watch Nolan work on some stranger's broken timepiece without saying much of anything at all. Some days they talked about Julian, about the brother Augustus had lost and the father Nolan never had the chance to know, and other days they simply sat in a silence that no longer felt like distance. Augustus never pushed for more than Nolan was ready to give, having learned, finally and painfully, that trust rebuilt slowly tended to hold far longer than trust demanded all at once. Eleanor eventually moved close enough to see her son regularly, careful to respect the space he still needed after everything that had been taken from him. She and Maeve grew close faster than anyone expected, the girl full of questions about a grandmother she had never known existed, and Eleanor answering each one with a patience that had clearly been waiting 20 years for the chance. Nolan watched them together sometimes from across the shop, feeling something settle inside him that he hadn't realized was still unfinished. The community trust Nolan established kept the old block standing largely as it had always been, its shopkeepers granted protections none of them had dared hope for only months earlier, and Briar Glen slowly became known less for the empire trying to swallow it, and more for the neighborhood that had refused to disappear. Shop owners who had spent years bracing for eviction notices found themselves instead sitting across from Nolan at folding tables, working out fair leases in plain language anyone could understand, a small irony that never stopped amusing him. He kept his old workbench in the back room exactly where it had always been, still fixing watches and clocks on slow afternoons, refusing to let a fortune change the rhythm of the life he had built by hand. Vivian visited the shop from time to time as well, no longer the sharp-edged executive who had once accused Nolan of scheming his way into a fortune, but someone closer to family, bound to him now by more than boardroom votes. One quiet afternoon, a customer at the shop accidentally left behind a wallet stuffed with cash, and Maeve picked it up, asking her father what they should do with it. Nolan only smiled, telling her she already knew the answer. Above them, mounted on the wall where it had hung silent for 20 years, Julian's old maritime clock began ticking again.